This is the GMT roundup. We're here finally. There's no doubt about it. Cheap watches are getting good. GMT watches especially so. GMTs are those models you may have seen that have got 4 hands rather than the ever-present 2 or 3. The added one being used to keep track of a second time zone. This gives them both a distinctive look, as well as some added functionality if you're a travel junkie. Thanks to the release of new lower-cost movements, the number of budget GMTs has exploded over the last couple of years. And for the most part, this is great. The more choices, the merrier as far as I'm concerned. However, even I've been feeling a little bit of analysis paralysis with so many of them launching. Which ones are actually the best? Well, to save you some time, I've painstakingly tried dozens of GMTs over the last few months, and today I'll be sharing with you 15 of my favorites. The particular models I think offer something unique in one way or another, all at an affordable price. We've got big brands, small brands, different colors, multiple sizes. Essentially, if you can't find something here, you never will. Crucially, unlike most videos on this topic, I've actually trialed these watches in the flesh. I either purchased or was sent each of these at my request. Oh, and they're actually affordable too. They finish at £1,000, not start there. I'll have them all linked or affiliate linked in the video description for your convenience. Fingers crossed they're all still available. First up, Quartz GMTs. Now these things are pretty elusive, but don't overlook them. True, there are barely any choices in this category, as Quartz hasn't received the same degree of experimentation as the automatics. However, there are some surprising options in here. The first one looks absolutely phenomenal, and it's definitely my favorite. In fact, it's one of my favorites overall on this list. It's the Timex GMT by Timex, and admittedly, it's far from the most impressive on paper. Acrylic crystal, a quartz movement under the hood, and a bracelet that's mediocre at best. Nevertheless, it's one of the lowest cost GMTs available, and by gosh, you never know. In person, it's a stunner. The measurements are perfect. At 38mm wide and with a particularly slim case, the GMT wears extremely well on just about anybody, just like its forebearer, the original Timex reissue. However, the GMT has received some minor alterations, such as a glossier dial and applied hour markers, which elevate the look to a major degree. And side by side, the standard Timex almost looks like a fake knockoff. As I mentioned in the unboxing video, the GMT feels like the Timex in its final form, the watch the original model was always meant to be. The bracelet, while not great as I alluded to, is still much less of a hair nipper than the first iteration, though there aren't any micro adjustments, which is quite frustrating. Thankfully, the GMT version is powered by a Swiss Ronda movement, a far quieter unit than the noisy Seiko PC33A found in the back of the standard one. Of course, the battery hatch on the back still comes in handy for speedy changes. It's not the best made watch for the money, but it is a fantastic looking choice from a historically significant watch brand. The Timex GMT is one of my very favorite recent pickups, and I'll be 100% keeping it for the foreseeable. Maybe I'll experiment with a strap change, we'll have to see. If you want a Quartz GMT with a better price to performance ratio, Chinese retailer AliExpress is where you'll want to head. Both standout options here are from Addiesdive. As with another brand I'll be mentioning later, Addiesdive rose to prominence with their ethically questionable homage watches, aka rebranded clones of luxury watch designs. However, both of these watches are more like half homages, with dials that do look akin to the Grand Seiko Elegance GMT, but with minor changes and notably different cases. If anything, one of the cases looks like it's instead been nicked from rival Chinese brand San Martin. The homage brands are now stealing from each other. So they won't be winning originality awards, but they aren't one-to-one copies, so I don't feel too bad for recommending them. Crucially, for well under 100 Great British pounds or $100 US each, these are easily the best value Quartz GMTs I've seen from a spec perspective, aside from some of the more blatant clones which are even cheaper. They've got comparable performance and actually slightly better materials than the Timex for less money, including either sapphire or mineral crystal depending on the model. At present, there's a sporty version with a bezel and a dressier one without. The former comes in beige only, while the latter can be bought in either beige or white. Out of the two, I'd say I just about prefer the latter, simply given the logo is a tad less offensive, though I don't think either look quite as crisp as the Timex. If you're on a super tight budget though, these 38mm Addiesdives are surprisingly capable cheap choices, especially if you've got a smaller wrist like me. For something more mainstream, and substantially larger, this Citizen may be worth considering instead. It's the Citizen Endeavour BJ7140, one of the few solar-powered GMT watches that that doesn't cost an arm and a leg. Now even this one is likely discontinued as it's out of stock almost everywhere, though Amazon seems to have a fair amount of stock left, for now at least. If you have a large enough arm, this 44mm beast has some admirable inclusions, such as an internal rotating bezel, sapphire crystal, and a class-leading 200-meter water resistance rating, alongside a multi-tiered dial. Admittedly, I think Citizen has definitely released some far better looking watches than this in recent times. The case is simplistic and bulbous, and while complex, the design is rather cluttered. Oddly, you'll notice the main branding text is applied on a raised transparent layer, which creates these unnecessary shadows. Nevertheless, solar GMTs with specs like this at this price are about as easy to come by as a lottery win, so that has to count for something. The integrated looking bracelet on this one is also serviceable and replaceable, though you may be limited by the narrow lug width. For those of you who want something big and durable for added time zone monitoring, it's a no-frills, safe bet. Similar could be said of the next watch, which finds itself in very much the same boat. The Quartz Boldr Venture GMT is the follow-up to the highly praised Venture automatic field watch that I reviewed a few years back. Like the Citizen, this Boldr is built primarily for performance, and is only present on grey market sites at the time of recording. It's a shame because if you can get this one, it offers a completely different look and form factor to anything else on this list. It has this somewhat stubby, compact 38mm titanium case with hooded lugs and probably the grippiest crown in the watch industry. It's got an array of top-tier specs as well, packed into that extremely lightweight body, such as a sapphire crystal and a diver-rivaling 20 ATM water resistance rating with a hefty case rear. As a side effect of this big screw back, you are left with an unfortunately thick profile for a Quartz watch, almost akin to their automatic Venture models. When combined with a NATO-style strap, it wears tall on the wrist, I have to say. So if you decide to track this one down, I'd either factor in the cost of the titanium bracelet for that perfectly integrated look that won't pass beneath the case, or instead consider substituting the stock band for a two-piece third-party alternative to keep the overall package as slim as possible. Now I've got this blue one, which is the only one I could track down, and I have to say this Quartz GMT is slightly better looking than the blue mechanical version I reviewed, though if I had the choice, the khaki would probably have been my preferred pick. Whether the Venture GMT will ever be restocked remains to be seen, but it's one of the better Quartz options if you're lucky enough to snag it. Another brand worth mentioning here that I didn't quite have a chance to get hold of is a Canadian brand called Momentum. They make a few different Quartz and solar Quartz GMTs, which I'll also link below. They're supposed to be quite good, but they wouldn't have arrived in time for filming. Something that did arrive in time for filming was this. Let me just change that a second. Was this a bunch of new features on the WatchCrunch app. If you haven't heard of it, our sponsor WatchCrunch is the social media platform specifically designed for watch nerds like me and you. It's a great resource to learn about new watches from the user-generated review section, and an ideal place to ask watch-related questions with the community poll creation tool. Yeah, if you can't decide between a couple of watches, then you can let the community decide for you. The mobile app for iOS and Android was recently updated with new features such as meetups and people search, allowing you to find or even meet up with other like-minded watch enthusiasts in a location that suits you. I think there's an upcoming meetup somewhere near me in Leeds in the UK. Maybe I'll make an appearance. Moreover, the new Collections tab lets you share, collate, and categorize your own watch collection, which you can then break down by style, wrist time, brand, movement, and more. Maybe you'll find a surprise gaping hole in your collection. Each morning, you can even share your favorite watches and recommend them to others in the daily wrist shot section too. There's sure to be something there to pique your interest. And with the new WatchCrunch app, you can do all this in seconds. It's also totally free to use, so go give WatchCrunch a try. You'll find a link to it in the video description. My follower count seems to have skyrocketed in recent weeks too, making this bald head just a little bit bigger. Now, if you can help me topple Max, who's one of the co-founders of WatchCrunch, it would be greatly appreciated. Now we have the automatics. There are no shortage of these available, so I'll split them into categories. Let's start with the Spec Monsters. I know a lot of you are solely after the most value-oriented pieces from a build and material perspective, so here are several to well and truly quench your thirst. First up, there can be no option other than the Boldr Admiral. Despite sounding like an Irish R&B singer, Chinese company Boldr makes what can only be described as the ultimate cheap GMT killer. For a retail price often lower than most Quartz GMTs, Boldr is somehow offering up a titanium timepiece that's topped with a sapphire crystal and powered by a Seiko NH34 mechanical movement. No doubt this is an extremely impressive, if not slightly concerning accomplishment. So if you care purely about specs for the money, the Admiral GMT is the runaway winner. In fact, it's clear that's all this brand was targeting. I mean, even the case rear directly says titanium and 200 meter. If that's not catering to the spec junkies, I don't know what is. Most aspects of this watch are pretty decent, and at 40.5 millimeters, the size is relatively serviceable too. Its main shortcoming, as you may have seen, is in the visual department. While it doesn't look bad for the money, the design is still pretty stale, and the brand name, it's a mess, isn't it? Also, the bracelet, while surprisingly being constructed mainly of titanium, also has no micro adjustment holes. Additionally, at such a low retail price, quality control will always be a concern. There are some reports of buyers experiencing water leakage despite the claimed 200 meter resistance rating, though others seem to have had absolutely no issues. All in all though, you won't find a dive style GMT that beats this on the spec front. It's worth also mentioning here that just like with the Quartz GMTs, there are plenty of automatic luxury watch clones on AliExpress, offering similarly turbocharged specifications for rock bottom prices. Nothing quite as strong as the Boldr, but you get the picture. Personally, I don't enjoy wearing these, it just doesn't make me feel good, but I'll link some of the better options below if you're feeling slightly less morally torn. One brand that would have sat plumb in that category a few years back is San Martin. Now they do still make plenty of these homages, but these days they sometimes dip their toes into the originality pool. In recent times, they have produced some truly stonking watches, all starting with this, the SN0129. The SN0129 is nothing short of outrageous for the money in all its guises. It basically redefines what can be obtained for under 300 quid. The original version houses a remarkably executed three-dimensional dune-style dial and exceptional case finishing, which when combined helps the SN0129 look shockingly premium from both close-up and at a distance. While numerous other SN0129 variants have subsequently been released, perhaps the best one is the Aventurine model, which boasts an intoxicating starry night effect normally reserved for much more expensive watches. While the dials are the clear standouts, the SN0129 also packs all the specs you can think of, including domed sapphire, big water resistance, and a Seiko automatic movement. It even has a great concealed adjustment system for a really comfortable bracelet fit. If you want more information, definitely check out the full review in the video description. As pointed out by some commenters, the design is somewhat reminiscent of an existing Grand Seiko GMT, which has a similar bezel and case, but I'd say this San Martin easily has enough unique elements to never be mistaken for that Grand Seiko in the flesh. With a bezel just shy of 38mm, a 39mm bezel, and a 46.5mm lug-to-lug, the size is extremely forgiving for a wide variety of wrists as well, meaning the watch has very few obvious flaws overall. The only recurring issue I've experienced with San Martin is that their bracelets, while nicely finished, do sometimes ship with a stiff link or two. Additionally, I know the logo isn't everyone's favorite, though I think it's more than passable and a darn sight better than San Martin's previous efforts. San Martin also occasionally makes special editions of their SN0129, the most recent of which was this limited edition model celebrating the Year of the Dragon. Not something for the faint-hearted, but quirky nonetheless. Aside from that one, San Martin has a couple of other GMTs that are worth briefly mentioning. The best of the bunch is comfortably the SN0116. This one is probably the slimmest mechanical GMT on this list, at only 12.3mm with a domed crystal and just over 10mm without it. It's a cleaner design than the SN0129, with all the same strong specifications and a comparable 39.5mm diameter. The root beer colorway in particular, with all the gilded appendages, is very, very pretty for the money. They've since released some more experimental non-GMT versions of this watch, though the standard variant is still my favorite. It's quite a different fit than the 129, with that thinner profile and a longer 47mm lug-to-lug, so it's pushing the boundaries of what my tiny wrist can realistically accommodate, though this will still fit most of you watching. If you've got a much bigger wrist than me, the much meatier SN0130 is probably worth a look instead. As you may have guessed by the codename, it's a sequel to the SN0129 I mentioned just, and it is very similar, though this time it comes with a very subtle dark mother-of-pearl dial, which is probably the best implementation of that material I've encountered on a watch. That said, this one ain't ever fitting me. At 42mm, it is much bigger, but it may be preferable for those of you who want that extra wrist presence. The final model rounding out this category comes from Thai watch brand Wise. Now, the ADX110 is a fairly good looking watch on the surface, with some exquisitely executed hour markers and hands that are probably the shiniest I've ever seen. Nevertheless, it's the hidden details that are arguably more impressive. For around $700 US, this Wise uses the same case material as Rolex, 904L stainless steel, as opposed to the more typical 316L steel used by the vast majority of watch brands, which I think is actually every other one on this list. 904L is harder to work with than 316L due to it having a different chemical composition, so it has a higher production cost and normally is only found in very high-end watches. The reason it's even used is because, when appropriately machined, 904L yields a higher polish than 316L, enhancing its beauty. Not that 316L looks particularly bad or anything, it's just that 904L edges it out. You'll see in the footage here that the case on this Wise watch has a luster that tops even a more expensive 316L offering, which I'll be mentioning later. Overall, very, very snazzy. It's also worth noting that 904L also has a couple of minor performance advantages too, primarily by way of enhanced corrosion resistance, which is useful for aquatic purposes. From my previous Mohs scratch tests, it also appears to be marginally more scratch resistant. So why else is a $700 watch in the Spec Monsters section? Well, there's another reason for the elevated price, and that's the movement. Inside the ADX110 is the Miyota 9075 True GMT movement. Now, this is quite different from the units powering most of the GMTs on this list. Most of the budget GMTs are what's known as caller style GMTs. They're made to allow you to adjust the GMT hand independently, so you can alter the second time zone in a pinch. The name comes from the fact that these are best suited to someone who'll be tracking a second time zone while remaining in the same location themselves. Think maybe a remote worker who needs to coordinate with colleagues who operate in a different time zone, or perhaps a relative is on their travels and you want to stay informed on the time in their current location. Should they fly elsewhere, you can switch the GMT hand to stay in sync. So that's how they work. Instead, this ADX houses a True or Traveler's GMT. These are tailored for the opposite sort of situation, if you're the one doing a lot of traveling. Here, you can't move the GMT hand, but you can adjust the main hour hand instead. If you swap into a different time zone, you can switch that while leaving the GMT unaffected, meaning it will keep tracking the time back home. These Traveler's GMTs tend to be found in much more expensive watches, primarily because they're more complex and thus costlier to manufacture. They're not necessarily better, but at around $700, this Wise is surprisingly one of the lowest cost means of attaining this style of movement. Weirdly, I actually wouldn't buy this one. While the monochromatic color scheme looks okay and very low key, I think the root beer version still looks head and shoulders above it. I only went with this one to give you a taste of a less widely used aesthetic. Some quick pros and cons. I think the logo and typefaces used are pretty generic and flat. The elaborate cathedral hour hand is also something you'll either love or hate. Nevertheless, the case offers up a very crisp, angular look, whose precision is matched by the spring-loaded glide lock-like clasp around the back, which essentially guarantees you a comfortable fit. The ADX wears very nicely, partly due to the slightly recessed bracelet, which conforms almost well enough for my skinny 6¼ inch wrist. With a 40mm bezel, it's unsurprisingly a tad too big for my arm, but again, its swooping sides are quite forgiving. Oh, and the bezel is pretty nice too. Now we have the lookers. While those last few shone on the spec sheet, these automatic GMTs excel in front of a camera lens. I've filmed them all. The largest of these is the Fleuss GMT from enthusiast brand Spinnaker. At 43mm across, or just slightly over that, it's not for the faint-hearted, and it's evidently far too big for my tiny arm. That said, for those of you with the girth to handle it, the Fleuss GMT offers a delightful design, presented in a range of vibrant color combinations. I think Spinnaker did an outstanding job with this in particular. Each version looks unique, distinctive, and daring without looking garish. In hindsight, I think the green version I ended up with is probably the weakest of the bunch. Many others have gradient dials, which give a sportier appearance that better matches the rest of the package, the burnt orange and nebula blue being particular highlights for me. The Fleuss GMT has good case finishing, and the specifications are nothing to be sniffed at either. While the included rubber strap is awesome too, the bracelet isn't the best. It looks fine on the surface, but my unit's clasp had a QC error, causing the double fold-over mechanism to easily flick loose. If this wasn't a press sample unit, I'd be sending this back for an exchange straight away. Our writer Chris did a great in-depth write-up on the pros and cons of this one, so check the description if you want a more detailed analysis. Overall, I think it's a fun option that can sometimes be had for a low price, especially if you use our 20% discount code, which you'll see on screen. For something more reserved, the Aviera by Swedish brand Nezumi is a little known option worth considering. I looked at this one a few months back and I thought it looked much better in person than online, a reverse catfish if you will. Aside from arriving in some heavily themed packaging, making it very viable for gifting if you're feeling particularly generous, the Aviera features great attention to detail in the strap department. Like the Spinnaker, it chips on a color coordinated strap, but this time it doesn't match the dial or bezel. No, it's a perfect match to the hands. The designer told me they experimented for a good while to find a one-to-one color match, and boy did they land on it. The material here is also unlike any I've tested before or since, with an extremely flexible, almost foam-like final result that conforms like a dream to your wrist. In fact, it might be the best synthetic strap I've tried. I would never actively pick a cream strap off the shelf, but it's truly won me over in this instance. Powered by a Miyota 9075 and adorned by a sapphire crystal, the rest of the specs are in check too. If you appreciate motorsports theming, the Aviera may be your first stop. The best tactical option I've seen comes by way of the aptly named Veer G5 Tactical. Now, I've never been a big fan of the whole tactical look, but after some chats with various watch designers, it turns out that these are a big hit in the US and other nations with looser gun restrictions. As such, I wanted to get at least one in here to scratch that itch, and there was no better choice than the G5. Essentially, this is a fully blacked out version of their popular Meridian GMT, incorporating a black PVD steel case, a dark sunburst dial, and high contrast white accents for maximum legibility. Luminescence is top tier, only outperformed by the Wise ADX I mentioned earlier. Even the bezel has great low light performance here. Like the Wise, it also uses a premium Miyota 9075 Travelers GMT, hence why it's one of the more pricier options on this list. On the product page, it says USA GMT, though that's a little misleading. The movement is Japanese, while the rest of the watch is assembled and QC checked in America, hence the text at the bottom center of the dial. I wouldn't say this one is quite as attractive as the D5 Pacific I recently reviewed, but the case and dial are still very sleek, with a dressier vibe than most tactical watches, which usually lean more into military theming. Veer was apparently founded for this exact purpose, to create timepieces that can be worn for both work and play. I think the G5 is a great example of that in action. It's not issue-free, however. The crystal is the main gripe, as the dome adds extra thickness to the already reasonably chunky profile. Its curvature also results in the G5 picking up more reflections than a boxed crystal, that being a crystal where the edges are curved but the upper surface remains flat. At 39mm and with a short lug-to-lug distance, it's versatile despite the thickness, and yeah, it just looks extremely classy. It's also got the best feeling bezel on this list too. If you want to support an American company who still does a lot of work in the US, then this Veer is a worthy choice. It's linked in the video description just like all the rest. Before we get onto the honorable mentions, we have the best sellers. These are the GMTs from big, renowned brands that have garnered widespread adoption or acclaim. The first two come from Seiko. Dating back to the 1880s, Seiko has a wealth of history and an abundance of models to pick from. The obvious choice from their lineup is the Seiko Field Sports GMT. This is a follow-up to the 5KX Sports Watch, a revamping of the cult classic SKX dive watch that hit the market back in 2019. It's basically the same watch, just with a different bezel and movement, and an elevated price tag to go with it. It's fairly attractive, comes in 3 colors. Actually, I think it recently got announced in a few more colors than that, and as you might have guessed, it's widely available from numerous retailers. My thoughts on this are roughly the same as with the regular 5KX. I think it looks more premium than the previous Seiko it was based on, although its subpar bracelet and hardlex crystal are obvious pain points considering the increased price. Unlike the regular 5KX, at least the smooth bezel ensures you can get perfect bezel alignment for once. At 42.4mm across, it has a wide stance on the wrist, though the 45.9mm lug-to-lug does alleviate it somewhat. If you want access to a big brand at a low price, this SSK could be the way to go. However, I'd lean towards a different SSK, which is also sometimes available for less money, that being the Seiko Field Sports Field GMT. I've heard people say this is the best GMT on the market, or a Rolex killer of some sort. And while I definitely wouldn't go that far, I do think this is the best of the budget Seiko GMTs. The black version in particular, the SSK023, is very well executed with a surprising level of detail and texture. It's also got more traditional proportions than the dive style GMT, meaning more of you will actually be able to pull it off. It's also one of the few instances where the pale green-hued luminescence actually works with the design of a watch. Usually green-tinted lume sticks out like a sore thumb, but here it seems right at home. Again, it has subpar specs compared to the bulk of this list, though both of these models will hold better resale value than their little-known alternatives, which can be useful later down the line if your tastes change and you decide to resell it. But if your taste is for finer things in life, then British brand Christopher Ward has a Swiss-made GMT that provides a luxury experience while scraping the ceiling of this list's budget. To be completely transparent, I doubt I'd ever personally spend this much on a watch. There's a reason I primarily focus on the cheaper models where you can often get 90% of the experience for a much lower price. That said, the Swiss-made Sealander C63 GMT does pack that extra 10% if you feel like it's worth it to you. And it's not like 20 grand or something. For a deeper delve, you can check out my full review of the black version in the description. The black model is decent. It has a beautifully cut case, the best mechanical movements, and the smoothest crown on this list. The whole package is very slim too, and this GMT even comes in multiple sizes, so you can pick the one that suits you the best. It's even kitted out with an exclusive micro-adjustable butterfly-style bracelet, one of the first of its kind in the world. Its primary shortcoming was the underwhelming visuals, which could be equaled or eclipsed elsewhere for less cash. I ultimately ended up sending that one back, and they later switched it with the Dragonfly Blue version, which, as I suspected in my review, is absolutely the one to go for. The watch looks exactly like it does in the pictures, with a vibrant sheen that could easily be accompanied by a David Attenborough voiceover if it had wings attached. It looks exquisite, and the niche tone works remarkably well with the orange used elsewhere, resulting in this blue model demolishing the other colors in the range. There's no question it's the best made watch here, it's more a matter of where affordable stops for you. Of course, there are a few other automatic GMTs worth mentioning. The Man Greenwich 38 is a very swanky bezel-free GMT, which only missed out due to it being discontinued. The Hudson GMT is also currently available for pre-order, but I couldn't get one in time for this video. That seems like an impressive diver-inspired option if the regular Hudson was anything to go by. That was one of my favorite watches a few years back. Two others also missed out due to time and budget constraints. The Vario Empire Seasons GMT is a gorgeous Art Deco style Japanese watch with a highly intricate dial. It's also one of the cheapest Miyota 9075 GMTs I've seen. Apparently the case and bracelet also have a special scratch resistant coating. I just wish I'd found the Empire earlier in my search. A similarly dressy edition also recently arrived in the form of the Seiko Presage Cocktail Time GMT. This one has the same elaborate dial surface as previous Cocktail Time models, with an added GMT complication slotted in. If you want to see my overall thoughts on the Cocktail Time, you can view our video on screen now, where I look at one of their best, lesser known models, and have a good laugh at Seiko's expense.